Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for your interest in our webinar today. We have a very good lineup for you, and I'm sure you will find both the presentations and the panel discussion very interesting. I am your host, and my name is Yildiz Williams, and I work for Lloyd's Register based in the UK. I am a chartered naval architect, and I specialise on marine environmental regulations. So our main topic is the upstream and operational emissions of alternative fuels for shipping, as you know. Why are we talking about this? Climate change is something we're all worried about, and we all want to play our part to turn things around. A few years back, we, Lloyd's Register, have undertaken a study with UMAS. And as part of this, we undertook a survey where we asked various questions to our stakeholders from shipping. And these were, the stakeholders were ship owners, operators, charters, banks, and so on. And one of the outcomes was that over 85% of our stakeholders were concerned about upstream emissions. So we know that while upstream emissions are not under the ownership of the shipping industry, it is crucially important to consider their impact at this stage to prevent investment in technologies that may ultimately not be any more green than those of a conventional ship. So at the time, our study also showed that shipping industry do not want to address greenhouse gas emissions in our industry only for that problem to be shifted upstream. So we knew that this was something they were passionate about. So what we're going to do today, we will start the webinar with two presentations from EDF and the IMO. First, Ether O'Leary from EDF and then Camille Bourgeois from the IMO will present some information for you. They will introduce themselves and then provide a short presentation. We will then move on to our panel discussion, and I will moderate this discussion, and we will take your questions during this time. As mentioned previously, so please use Slido app on your screen to send us your questions. You can start doing that now. If you already thought about your question, please do so. The webinar is for 1 hour, and we will try to answer as much question as possible during this time. When we come to the panel discussion, you will also hear from our panelists. Just before the panel discussion, they will introduce themselves briefly and give you a brief introduction to their point of view in relation to today's topic. So let's move to our presentation. So thank you. And this was my message. So now we'll move to Aoife and Camille. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Aoife O'Leary from the Environmental Defence Fund. And I am just going to share my screen for my presentation. Just 1 second. So what I'm going to present today is going to be, here we go. I hope that works for everyone. We did a study along with UMAS that we released earlier in the year. And it's jumping ahead already. But anyway, I'm going to talk through that. Basically, we looked at fuels rules for aviation and asked whether they were good and whether they could then be applied to shipping. So this is just a quick background slide. I'm sure Camille will say more about this in his presentation, but just to lay out how important reducing emissions from shipping is and the big lift that is going to have to be done almost entirely by alternative fuels. So the black line along the top is business as usual for shipping emissions. And the red line just underneath that is a deal that was agreed just about a week and a half ago at the IMO on short-term measures. Now, I'm not going to go into the details on what was agreed, etc., but just to give that illustration that there's a huge amount left to be done on reducing emissions. And also shout out to the International Council on Clean Transportation for this graph. And they also actually did this one as well. And again, this is just laying down background. As Yildiz said, if you don't look at the full emissions from any fuel, you could actually be changing to a fuel that is worse for the environment than the one you're already using. So this actually just shows current fuels. We're going to get on to kind of future fuels in a minute, but you can see already that there's huge differences. So the brown at the bottom is the emissions from the ship, the downstream emissions. And then the blue on top is the upstream emissions, which are from the extraction of the fuel, processing, things like that. And then the red is methane slip, which is obviously incredibly applicable to LNG vessels. So just to make the point already that even with the fuels that shipping is using today, we really need to be very, very careful and look on a full life cycle basis of those fuels to make sure that any fuel the shipping industry uses is actually better than the fuel they were using before. This is just a quick schematic from UMAS, but essentially when you look at potential fuels of the future that reduce emissions, and you look in terms of environment, economics, and the technical criteria, it all points towards ammonia and hydrogen. Now, ammonia and hydrogen can be produced through a number of different processes with different feedstocks. So this comes back to how we're going to calculate the life cycle of fuels. Because if you produce those fuels using, for example, natural gas, you could actually make the emissions worse for the environment than they were before. And the climate doesn't care whether those emissions were coming from land as you produce those fuels and nothing from the ship. The climate just cares about the overall total of emissions. We have to be very careful about that. So at the Environmental Defence Fund, we have been looking at this for a few years, and we've really been focused on the opportunity that the future fuels for shipping give to countries around the world that have large renewable capacity. Because while you can produce those fuels from gas, you can also produce them from renewable energy, which is my favorite kind of ammonia and hydrogen. And that just provides this huge opportunity for investment around the world. But as I said, that means then we have to be very careful. And so that's where our paper that I'm going to speak about now came from. Because we said, well, you know, this is not a new question. We've been struggling with this in the environmental movement for quite a long time. And looked at different places where this question had been analysed. And aviation faces a number of the same problems as shipping in that it's an international sector, it's a transport sector. You can use fuels that when they come out of the tailpipe of the aircraft, reduce emissions. That doesn't actually mean it reduces emissions in total. So spot the difference. This is the IMO and also ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. I'm kind of assuming that most people on this webinar, know the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, but they're both the two UN bodies that regulate shipping and aviation respectively. And now obviously the two modes of transport are very different. And I'm not gonna, pretend to you all that they're all exactly the same. And there's definitely nuances where we would look at things that have been agreed in aviation and say, well, we maybe need them a little bit different in shipping. But on the whole, the principles that have been agreed for sustainable fuels in aviation are very applicable to shipping. And one of the other ways, I guess, aviation and shipping are very alike, unfortunately, is there has been large emissions from both sectors. And both UN bodies have been discussing what to do about it for a long time with very little impact. But one of the things that ICAO has agreed is called CORSIA, which is the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that scheme or how it operates, but suffice to say that you can use sustainable alternative fuels as a way to meet your obligations. So then that obviously raises the question, well, what is sustainable fuel? So we looked at what ICAO had decided on that and made some key recommendations that then can be transferred into shipping and the IMO. So here's the first set of them. I'm not going to go into too much detail on any of these. Our paper is readily available for anyone who wants to read it. And with a lot of people heading back into lockdown, we might all have a lot of time to do reading, but anyway. The main recommendation I've already said many times, it's got to be a full life cycle analysis. One of the key, decisions in ICAO was around biofuels, because there is a misnomer that biofuels are just carbon neutral, especially if they're crop biofuels, because those crops absorb CO2 from the air and then emit it on the tailpipe, and sure, it's all even. But that's not necessarily true. There's accounting there anyway, but in addition to that, there can be indirect effects. So if you use you could cut down a forest directly to grow the crops, which would obviously cause deforestation. There's also displaced use of agricultural land, things like that. So it's really, really important to make sure biofuels are not just given a pass, a zero rating. But the same principle has to apply to all fuels. And in addition, which I've also already talked about, you have to make sure you look at all the different greenhouse gases. So CO2 has historically been the biggest gas emitted by shipping, and probably will continue to be so for a long time. But methane is gaining a share, and we will potentially have other gases in the future. Like I said, the climate doesn't care whether the emissions come from on land or sea. The climate also doesn't really care about what the molecule is. The molecule that is causing that emission will have different impacts. So for something like methane, we talk about it having a very strong short-term impact. But that short-term is over a 20-year horizon, and we really have the next 10 years to get this sorted. So it's something we absolutely have to be very, very careful about. So another set of key lessons, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on any, but suffice to say that transparency and governance linked to that are really key. So during this whole process, we'll have to make sure that the IMO is fully resourced to put the right regulations in place. And that's one of the things that we're hoping with this paper we can do, is to try and save some time and energy by bringing over a copy and paste from ICAO where useful, but also making sure that everyone can understand and access the use of alternative fuels in shipping. And then just two other quick things to mention before I wrap up. So one is a full range of sustainability criteria. And what I mean by that, I've already spoken a lot about the different emissions, but there are other things to take into account, such as human rights, water rights, land rights for local people. There's a whole criteria that need to be addressed, and they are just as important as emissions. So we have to keep that in mind. And then also, if you could put in place a minimum threshold for reductions, it helps, or it avoids stranded assets in the industry. So this is about ensuring that any fuel that we say is sustainable is meeting a minimum reduction compared to standard fuel. So for example, if we're talking about our standard fuel in shipping, let's talk about low sulfur heavy fuel oil, or low sulfur fuel oil. If you wanted to bring in another fuel, we would recommend that it should at least be 50% better in terms of emissions than that fuel, because this means that you're not investing in a fuel that is only about 10%, 20% better. And then you have to invest in another fuel to go for the rest of that reduction. So it just makes sure that you don't invest in stranded assets. But as I said, all the recommendations are in the paper, and we're very happy to discuss any of them with anyone who wants to. And then just one final plug, which is for another webinar we're going to have on the 12th of November. It is hosted by IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. And we're hoping to send around the slides after this, so you'll get a registration link. But you can also just email me or keep an eye on the Environmental Defence Fund Europe Twitter, and you'll see registration there. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll take the floor now. Thanks, Aoife. Thanks, Yildiz. Good afternoon, maybe good morning, good evening to all participants. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to provide some opening remarks from the IMO perspective. Well, obviously, this is not an IMO meeting, but the topic upstream and operational emissions of alternative fuels for shipping is highly relevant for IMO's further work on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the maritime sector. Before jumping into the matter at hand today, let me just quickly say a few words about the most recent regulatory development at IMO on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping. Despite the pandemic, the Intersessional Working Group on Reduction of GHG Emissions from Ships met remotely in October, just a few days ago, to develop short-term binding measures aimed at reducing the carbon intensity of the existing fleet by at least 40% by 2030 compared with 2008. The result of its work is a set of draft amendments to MARPOL Annex 6, which will be presented to MEPC 75 later this month for approval and adoption in 2021. The concept of the proposed basket of measures is to combine a new energy efficiency existing ship index, the EEXI, addressing the technical performance of the ship, and a new mechanism to address the operational carbon intensity of the ship based on indicators, CIIs, and associated rating system and enhanced energy efficiency management tools on board and at the company level. Obviously, the proposed measures will not be sufficient on their own to achieve full decarbonization. They are designed as short-term measures, and they are aimed at reducing the carbon intensity of ships in line with the 2030 goal, whilst at the same time providing building blocks for future measures. Alternative fuels now. The initial strategy highlights the major role of alternative low carbon and zero carbon fuels. The fourth IMO greenhouse gas study about to be approved foresees that more than 60% of the emissions reduction effort in 2050 would come from alternative fuels. And as there is growing awareness on which fuel sources are likely to play a role in shipping, the life cycle emissions associated to these fuels, together with potentially a number of other sustainability criteria, will become an increasing point of attention. Due to the pandemic, the recent working group meeting was held remotely and focused on the finalization of draft amendments to MARPOL Annex 6. Therefore, several agenda items had to be postponed, including the consideration of guidelines on life cycle, GHG, carbon intensity of all types of fuels. We hope, of course, to be able to resume this discussion as soon as possible. In the meantime, we intend to organize an informal discussion session in the coming months, similar to the ones organized in July and October, to facilitate the understanding of proposals put on the table for the short-term measures. We are aware that discussions are happening in various places, but our role, I think, is to ensure that inclusive discussions can take place under the IMO umbrella. Meanwhile, IMO is accelerating its efforts to act as the global forum and promoter of R&D in low carbon and zero carbon marine fuels, bringing together interested stakeholders from public and private sector. IMO will, in this regard, co-host the Global Maritime Innovation Forum in the first half of 2021, which will be focusing on alternative marine fuels. Finally, according to the initial strategy, discussions should start soon at IMO on so-called innovative emission reduction mechanisms, including market-based measures, to incentivize the uptake of alternative renewable fuels. With that, I hope that this event will contribute to raise awareness on the issue of life cycle emissions and mobilize stakeholders to accelerate the energy transition of shipping. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those two very interesting presentations. Thank you, Aoife and Camille. So now we will move on to our panel discussion. Let me just very briefly introduce you to our panelists. They will also provide you with a short bio and then their point of view, as I mentioned before. So you know who I am, so let's move on. Within our panel, we have Petra Dubkova, Maritime Transport Policy Analyst from Waterborne Directorate General for Mobility and Transport of the European Commission. We have Tori Longva, Principal Consultant, Maritime Regulatory Affairs, DNV Maritime. Dr. Tristan Smith, Associate Professor in Energy and Transport at UCL and Principal Investigator of the Decarbonising UK Freight Network Plus project. And we have Sunil Krishnakumar, Senior Technical Advisor, International Chamber of Shipping. So what I will do now, I'll open the panelists from the order I've mentioned their names to give you a brief introduction about themselves and their point of view from just a brief introduction in terms of the topic that we're talking about today. And then I have some questions in Slido. I'll start going through those, but let's have a little brief introduction from each person. So we'll start with Petra and then Tori, Tristan and Sunil, please. Thank you.
Hello, Yildiz. Good afternoon also from my side, and thank you very much for giving me the floor. It is a pleasure to discuss this very important topic also in the webinar today. Thanks a lot to the organizers, of course, as well to the European Environment Development Fund and of course also IMarEST. It's a bit difficult in 2 minutes that I was given by the organizers to give both the brief introduction and the views on the topic, but maybe just to say a few words. Indeed, I'm working in the mobility and transport section of the European Commission on the IMO coordination, alternative fuels, and ship energy efficiency measures. I'm not a naval architect by training. I'm an economist, but luckily I have a full support of my experts also in the team, as well as in our Maritime Safety Agency and the Joint Research Center, which already does a lot of work on the alternative fuels, also in terms of aviation. I would just say a few main comments, if I can, from my perspective, also from the point of view of discussing with the experts in the framework of the European Sustainable Shipping Forum, where we actually have a debate on the methodology to calculate the life cycle emissions from the fuels, energy sources used on board ships. So I'm quite a privilege actually to also have that debate in between the meetings that Camille mentioned earlier are happening at IMO, and for the moment eyes on the prize on the short-term energy efficiency measures. So we are also of course heavily involved there, but at the same time we are keeping the momentum and the discussion also going for the alternative fuels, which I would just like to stress that indeed it is also a short-term measure. I think Camille have stressed that already, but I think it's quite important to remember that at IMO we are really only now embarking on the discussion on actually what alternative fuels are. The IMO initial strategy talks about zero and low carbon emission fuels, but we haven't yet have the definition or discussed actually what is a low carbon emission fuel, how much lower than the conventional fuels it would have to be. And that's why it's of critical importance to actually come up first with a robust methodology to calculate and assess what actually is the emission performance of the fuels used on board ship over their life cycle. So not only on the tank to wake perspective, on the tailpipe if you want perspective, but also on the upstream emission. So it's a little bit also different. The state of discussion is different than at ICAO because I think Aoife clearly said that indeed there the approach to actually account for the alternative fuels has been developed for the purpose of the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme, which actually started with the offsets in the first place, and the alternative fuels were added then later on for the purpose as an alternative actually to the offsets, which I would hope that from the shipping perspective, it's not really reinventing the wheel, but there we could move straight, let's say, to avoid some of the I don't want to say use some of the lesson learned and maybe avoid some of the unintended consequences that we have seen that the methodology used for the purpose of CORSIA is creating. And we will yet see how, because it anyhow will enter into force only as of the 1st January next year. So we will see how actually how well it incentivizes the approach taken by ICAO, how well it incentivizes the uptake of alternative fuels. I know my time is almost up, but maybe just to say, indeed, for us, it's of a critical importance to take into account upstream emissions. Not only that, we are also looking, such as in comparison to ICAO again, which they are not looking, we are also looking at the non-CO2 emissions at the well-to-wake perspective. So looking at methane slip, looking at nitrous oxide, etc., on the tank to wake perspective, which is also very important from the ship perspective, and that's very well a known regulation that IMO does, and there we are also pushing for a more methodology to be developed there. Again, extremely important to incentivize the uptake of sustainable fuels, to avoid actually the uptake of those that can actually have overall worse even emission footprint over their life cycle than of the fossil fuels. I think Aoife mentioned that already in her introduction, and Yildiz, you as well, but it's extremely important to always keep that in mind, because indeed this is something that happens, and we are on the verge of enrolling and incentivizing the uptake of alternative fuels in shipping. And I think we should think twice actually what kind of fuels we want to start with. We also don't want to lock into the technologies and the fuels that can actually prove to be at that end at the end of the day. Extremely important from this perspective to guide the future investments, to support again the uptake of those fuels, and then to provide a clear sustainability criteria. But those we can come back to later. So I think I already completely exhausted my time limit, Yildiz. Sorry about that, but I hope we can come back on some of these issues during the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Tori, please.
Thank you, and thank you for arranging this great webinar, and it's a very interesting and an important topic. So my name is Tore Longva. I work for DNVGL in Oslo, Norway. So I have been working with maritime environmental regulations for more than 10 years. I've been following closely the development in the IMO already from the early beginnings with the Energy Efficiency Design Index, and now with the short-term measures soon to be approved, we see also that it's the right time to have a closer focus on the fuels. There are many issues to consider, so I will use my brief time to try to give my point of view on some of the more important issues. So the likely fuels that the DNVGL have identified through our various studies is that it could be anything from ammonia, methanol, diesel, methane, hydrogen. All of these can be produced in different ways and with various degrees of emissions. So it's not possible to determine today which of those fuels will be the ideal fuel for the future of shipping. There are many things playing in here, not least the primary energy source that you use for these fuels. So the IMO needs a framework that can cover all these fuels, and it's very important that the IMO and its member states sets the expectations to the fuels with regards to environmental aspects and also safety. This in order to give a clear signal to ship owners, fuel producers, and other stakeholders under what framework and expectations they should work under. We also need to avoid any unintended consequences. I think we already alluded to some of them in previous interventions here. It may sound trivial, but it's not. It's actually very difficult, and we have seen some recent examples. For example, with the sulfur requirements of fuels, exhaust gas cleaning systems, scrubbers, are an equivalent measure, and the wash water discharge here is an unintended consequence of that, and this has become a quite contentious issue there. Examples that how that could play out for fuels could be the sustainability aspect of biofuels. So by not being very clear on what's a sustainable biofuel, we might end up with biofuels we don't really want to have. Next point to raise is how are we going to address upstream and downstream emissions? If you look at the downstream emissions, the tank to wake, from the fourth greenhouse gas study, CO2 is the main contributor here, and CO2 emissions are well covered already in current regulations, and it's also relatively simple, as it usually is a factor of the fuel used. However, there is how do we account for biofuels, which also contain carbon, but it might be accounted in a different way. So that needs to be added. Methane, dinitrous oxides, two other potent greenhouse gases. Bit more tricky because they are a function also of the engine type used. So there are currently no standard methods for measuring these. And we also need to figure out how we're actually going to include those in a framework. Is it going to be a testbed measurement or an operational measurement, something else? If you turn to the upstream emissions, we run in a very different set of challenges. So emissions from extraction and production formally falls under the scope of national inventories, and they also should be regulated nationally. But to avoid these unintended consequences, shipping, of course, needs to take into account and have a framework that takes into account the upstream emissions. One example here is that ammonia is a zero carbon fuel. It does not release any CO2 emissions when combusted. But if it's produced from fossil methane, for example, without a carbon capture, there is not a very environmental friendly fuel in total. So the IMO is very much an expert on regulating ships and ship equipment. Production of fuels is not part of that remit. And if you look at current fuel regulations, the IMO set a few very high level requirements, such as the flash point of the fuel and also the sulfur content. So, and to document this, they use external standards, such as the ISO. IMO hasn't developed own standards on these aspects. So although it's possible that IMO can become an expert on fuel production, we need to carefully consider if IMO is the right body to develop the detailed standards there. IMO should focus on the high-level requirements, both on upstream greenhouse gases and other sustainability aspects. The final point I want to make is the level of detail. IMO needs a framework for outlining the scope of upstream and downstream emissions and how it need to decide how they should interact with current and new regulations. So IMO has come further than ICAO had when it developed its guidelines. IMO already has I know it's soon to have the carbon rating system, carbon intensity rating system. It has already the energy efficiency design index, which applies carbon factors. So we need to figure out how we are kind of plug in a new framework into that. And then other aspect here, and this is the final aspect, is we need to balance how detailed we go. So we have already used default or average factors. They can be the useful simplifications, but also we have unintended consequences here. We need to avoid that they prevent innovation and technology development because a new solution doesn't fit into this framework, or they're hindered by default factors that are based on outdated solutions. So we need a careful balance between administrative burdensome mechanism and also an accurate representation of emissions, both upstream and downstream. That was my initial point of view. So looking forward to discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tori. Tristan, you are next.
Thank you, Yildiz. Hello, everybody. Thank you to IMarEST for the opportunity to take part in this. I'm speaking as a co-author of the report that was presented by IFA, which we wrote with EDF about the ICAO work, but also as a co-author of an IMarEST submission into the IMO process on this subject. And I'm going to share initially some of the remarks from that submission, because IFA's already done an excellent job of presenting that other paper. So the submission that the way that we thought about that submission to the IMO was to describe this as a subject about moving capital in the right direction. How does the capital that we currently deploy in the energy system and the shipping system move towards decarbonisation? And the way that we've often worked on that is to figure out what the numbers might look like, and therefore what the timescales are for how quickly that capital will need to move. So to give you a brief overview of that, we think there's trillions of dollars, certainly over 1 trillion, that is likely to be needed across the energy system, the shipping system, to decarbonise. And actually, nearly 80% or over 80% of that is likely to be on the land side. So actually, when we look at the shipping decarbonisation puzzle, this is predominantly an upstream issue, and therefore where a lot of the risk lies, both for the sector, which I guess is why the respondents to the survey that Yildiz mentioned were so concerned about the upstream, but also because that's where if we set the wrong framework and we cause investments to flow in the wrong direction, we're going to have a lot of stranded assets. The timescale issue is extremely urgent. If we want to get anywhere close to the IMO's initial strategy objectives, let alone an IPCC 1.5 aligned decarbonisation profile, we estimate needed about $300 to $400 million already committed by 2030 to zero carbon fuels. So this is not a problem for 2 decades' time. This is a problem where investment cases need to be being worked up this decade in order to be approved by the end of the decade. And those investment cases will only be built up in time if we have the frameworks in place. The IMO LCA guidelines are the most obvious place that we could envisage doing them. They set a global standard, so all the cliches about the need for global regulation also apply to the LCA guidelines. And good LCA guidelines would also help us, as I think Tore was alluding to, make sure that we are genuinely fuel agnostic and stimulate innovation, that we don't kind of create risks on the unintended consequences to the innovation process. The key challenge that we think exists for the IMO is really just how to do this in practice. And I think some of the questions appearing on Slido allude to that already. I mean, we can see the theory quite clearly, but the practical implementation for a body that normally regulates on the vessel and not on the energy system is quite a bit less obvious than some of the other types of regulatory challenges the IMO has met previously. But the work that we've done suggests that the bunker delivery note is likely to be a key mechanism for this, just as we saw it used when the IMO regulation on sulfur regulations, essentially something which was about desulfurizing the supplied fuel, and therefore not really something that happens on the ship. It was the BDN, which is there at the interface between the fleet and the suppliers of energy to ships, that was the mechanism for essentially conveying the incentivization or the regulation into the energy system. And something similar is likely to be the solution for the life cycle emissions problem. So to summarize, I think we've got LCA, and by that what I mean is a proper accountancy for the upstream is critical if we're going to avoid unintended consequences. IMO is the obvious place to do this if it can form the regulation, and given that billions are now flowing into green fuels, we're arguably already too late to do this. So this is super urgent. The debate needs to agree to include upstream, but then move on to all the detail. And Tore gave a much more comprehensive description of some of those detailed questions that will need to be tackled. And then the question is, how do we do that given the competence? How do we leverage other bodies that are working in the same area and solve these at the detail level? And that's what I wanted to conclude on. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan. Sunil, please.
Yeah, thank you, Yildiz. Hope everyone can hear and view me properly. Yep, thank you, and good day to all. As mentioned in the introduction, I am a senior technical advisor at ICAO. We are the principal trade association of global ship owners and operators. Myself, I'm a marine and mechanical engineer by education, and I have about a decade's experience as an engineer on ships before I joined ICAO, where I handle topics related to fuels and their emissions. First of all, greetings to everyone. I hope everyone is keeping well and safe wherever they are in the world. To start off the discussion, I think it's worth highlighting that the global maritime industry is determined to meet the IMO targets for GHG reduction. With regards to the long-term goal of meeting the 2050 target, as one of the previous speakers mentioned it, to achieve that big lift, we think, which is quite obvious, that it can only be met by a very significant uptake of alternative fuels. An unavoidable aspect of all this process is the need to accelerate R&D. This cannot be overstated. ourselves as ICS and our colleagues in other industry associations. We continue working closely together with member states at IMO through various proposals, including those to provide resources from within the industry for these R&D. Just to start off with some comments on ICAO, while we welcome the consideration of the ICAO framework in the proposal from IMarEST, I think for us it might be worth highlighting that that even though aviation has an agreed trading mechanism, for us this hasn't. It isn't obvious that it has yielded any true emissions reduction yet. We know from credible sources that aviation's emissions have actually increased after the introduction of CORSIA. And if you compare that to IMO, IMO has a clear agreed pathway for emissions reduction and elimination. I would go on to say that the maritime sector has managed to decouple our emissions from trade growth since the year 2009. Of course, more needs to be done, and I think that's where the IMO targets are important. On the issue of upstream emissions, upstream and operational emissions of alternative fuels, we believe it is very important to be aware of the factors such as the sustainability of the fuels, the GHG emissions at each stage of the fuel of the fuel's life, and other aspects such as previous speakers have mentioned. We believe it's important for us as the owners and operators to take informed decisions on where we should where our members have to invest. Taking this into account, ICS has actually co-sponsored the paper that Norway has put into IMO for the next MEPC that proposes the introduction of a life cycle label for alternative fuels, and as explained by previous speakers, this would form part of the PDN. To provide a more holistic perspective from our members, our priorities to achieve as much clarity as we can and the guidelines that need to be prepared by the IMO on this issue. Like I briefly alluded to earlier, ship owners need to have the confidence that their investment in lower carbon fuel ships don't get stranded in the future just because policymakers change their mind down the line. To close my brief introduction, I would highlight the uptake of exhaust gas cleaning systems and liquefied natural gas as a marine fuel as examples where billions of dollars worth of investment by owners and operators. If you think about it, most of whom acted in good faith as early movers in these innovative technologies. These investments are at risk because of significant policy changes after these investments were made. So we hope lessons will be learned and these mistakes won't be repeated. That's my brief introduction, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. So everybody, all the panelists gave brief introductions about themselves and their point of view. So what we're going to do now, go through the questions. There are quite a lot of questions, and I don't think we'll be able to answer all of them, but I'll start with the first one. Let me read through. Okay. With fuel passing hands many times before being used, is there a framework proposed to account and verify the emissions well to wake of fuel used in shipping? So can I pass that to perhaps Tristan, and Petra might like to add some views as well?
Yes, the short answer is no. I think that the place where we're at in the discussion at the moment is to figure out the higher level than that. What's within the IMO's remit and what happens at the interface between the IMO and the land side. The process that then is carried out on the land side in order to provide the information in a verified form, such that the bunker supplier could put numbers in a BDN and be confident that they had the right numbers in there, is something that will also need a lot of development work. So again, there is lots to do on this subject, but we can't start soon enough. I would say that there are examples of companies that have got concepts as to how one could do this. Bunker Trace is one example. I'm sure there are others like it where they combine traceability techniques with digital signatures on the fuel as it goes through various different steps that were alluded to in the question. But this is really a question for the landside legislators as well, and I don't want to speak on behalf of them on what is practical or not practical in that perspective. But maybe Petra can.
Thanks a lot, Tristan. No, I don't want to speak on behalf of all the landside regulations, but maybe I can say that indeed we already have in place certification schemes for the upstream emissions, also for the alternative fuels used in transport, including in maritime. So this is what we have been already using at EU level for quite a while now. I think more than a decade. When the fuels that actually are required to fulfill certain sustainability and GHG emission saving criteria are to be used for the transport purposes and are being delivered from third countries in the world, have to comply. So and the similar certification scheme actually also is proposed by the aviation in the sense of course in the framework of the CORSIA. So it's actually not what I want to say that when you look and we can give you some examples and you can look at for yourself, it's actually a very much a quality standard schemes that every fuel supplier throughout the value chain actually have to comply with to receive a certain certificate of quality to prove that they can actually trace the source of the fuel production pathway, the transportations, the co-production, etc., and can deliver when they deliver the fuel, the final chain by the the bunker delivery node or by anything else, where they can actually certify not only the quality of the fuel, but also the GHG saving criteria and the compliance with the sustainability criteria as required. So that actually also replies a little bit to the issue that Tore has raised earlier in his intervention. And I know it creates a lot of fear and maybe uncomfortable discussion for the shipping sector who is not used to deal with these type of emissions. But we are not asking, as a matter of principle, and nobody should be doing that. We are not asking IMO and of course an organization that really is an expert on the shipping to start becoming an expert on the fuel production pathway methodologies and the reattribution of emissions. That certainly is not the case. There are other bodies and methodologies and quality standards that actually define how this is done, how this is qualified, and all what we need to actually request is that we actually have that the operators have a certificate that they can use then for the operations to demonstrate actually what the GHG emission saving criteria has been, and also of course, the organization must agree on what the criteria, what kind of fuels it wants to have it used as a matter of principle in shipping. So that's one of the prerequisites, but not becoming an expert on the upstream emissions and on the fuel production pathway. That's certainly not the case. One of the issues I wanted also just to say is the administrative burden and the default versus actual values, because again, similarly, I mean, what we already apply now to the shipping sector at the EU level, but also to other transport and other sectors of the economy as a matter of principle. And I know that's the same again for CORSIA, that indeed to minimize the administrative burden and allow the operators to really to calculate the performance of the fuel they used on board very easily is to provide a set of default values, again according to an agreed methodology, and that this would need to be agreed with the experts in IMO. That's quite clear, but also allow the operators then to demonstrate the actual values if they feel that they actually have a competitive advantage in and are able to provide to prove that actually the actual values are lower than the default one. So I think this is one of the incentive scheme that has proven to work rather well, both in terms of let's say the non-CO2 emissions in terms of the slippage, but also in terms of the upstream emissions so far. So just to say a few words that this exists and has been proven to work rather efficiently so far. So there is nothing to fear. Thanks.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions for Tori, and I'll just read them out. One of them says, you say CO2 is well covered in current regulations, but emissions have not gone down due to current regulations. Can you say more about what you mean? And also there's another question, Tori, or maybe if you want to just go ahead with that one, we'll cover the other one later.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's so what I meant with that is that CO2 is now, it is a part of the Energy Efficiency Design Index regulation. It's part of the data collection system where you apply a carbon factor to the fuel consumed. So CO2 is covered, and it's pretty well covered in my opinion. Then the fourth greenhouse gas study also have shown that its emissions have been reduced in 2008 and also since. But then the question is whether that's due to the regulations coming into place or not. I don't think we'll go into that discussion here. I think the main point was that CO2 is actually covered in regulations.
Thank you. I'll just move on to one of the questions. Could nuclear fuel steal the thunder of new future fuels as source of future marine propulsion? Can I ask that to Sunil?
Yep, thanks, Yildiz, and thanks for that question. It's a very interesting one. You can see it in the media these days that this option is getting quite interesting. My answer to that question is yes. Why not? Ship owners and operators are willing to try whatever option is proved to be safe for use. Being somebody from the maritime industry who has worked on ships with these engines, safety is obviously a very big factor, which needs to go in parallel with the life cycle analysis of emissions. So even with the current options on the table, like ammonia, which is extremely toxic if it's not handled properly, but that doesn't mean that these can't be used as future fuels. The IMO has its own work stream on alternative fuels, say through the IGF code, where lots of these new fuels, guidelines for use of all those, a lot of these new fuels are taking place. So if there are enough safeguards in place, then all options are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. One other question I have in here says, why is there so much focus on taking new approaches to quantify upstream emissions for maritime? Some of the fuels may differ, but the principles are the same. So who would like that? Either Tristan or... Okay, Tristan, put his hand up.
Yes, thanks for the question. I think Alan might be referring perhaps to the ISO work that is ongoing on defining upstream emissions or green life cycle emissions of transport and transport fuels. And I guess this is we've tried to allude to this, I think, perhaps in the answer that I gave, but also perhaps what Tore was saying, that the IMO has a certain amount of expertise and it will need to leverage that expertise elsewhere, and where principles, data have been established in other international agreements, then assuming that there is agreement to then use those within the IMO, I see no reason not to. So, sorry to use the cliche, but there's definitely good justification not to reinvent wheels in this. But ultimately, if the IMO is to make these decisions, it needs to be the one that makes the decision to use other organizations' data rather than assume that it will use them by default. And I think that's the debate that we still haven't had, and therefore it's hard to say at this point whether or not that's a given. But it seems to be, if there is something available from ISO, it would be odd not to use it.
Okay, thank you, Tristan. Okay, Etha, this one is for you. Your slides showed some LCA that were in significant contrast with similar exercises undertaken by ThinkStep. Could you comment on the difference in the LCA of LNG?
Yeah, sure. So those slides I took from the International Council on Clean Transportation, and actually if you go into that report, it has an annex that compares their results to ThinkStep and explains why, but it's to do with the global warming potential they used. So because methane is so impactful in the short term, what they looked at was the 20-year impact and also the 100-year impact, rather than, I guess most places do just look at a 100-year impact. So that's where the difference was. ThinkStep didn't look at the short-term impact of methane, but I'm sure the ICCT would be happy to give more on that if anyone is interested. And I'm happy to put you in touch if you want to get in touch with me.
Excellent. Okay, just going down. Okay, maybe this is something, in what circumstances can double counting creep in? Is this something perhaps Tristan can help us?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of types, but the most obvious one is to do with when a national inventory includes a certain amount of emission within it, and then the IMO, which is supposed to only cover international shipping, also counts for the emissions that occurred on land and might have been included in, for example, the UK's greenhouse gas inventory. Then we have a problem where when we put all of the numbers together in a process like the UNFCCC process, we might see a larger amount of emission because one organisation or country had also included numbers that were supposed to have been accounted for in another organisation. So that's often where we could perceive that there's a problem here. Let's make this very separate. Let's have the IMO just look at operational emissions, and then all the national governments can do their accountancy for the landside emissions, which is basically what we refer to as the upstream emission for most of the shipping fuels. The problem that we have there is that works in theory, but the NDCs, the UNFCCC framework, is a very loose structure. It is not something which forces everyone to achieve a certain amount of reduction at a certain speed. And as long as that continues, then we don't have a structure which is going to be guaranteeing that shipping's fuels would be produced in a zero carbon way. And obviously we have the United States in a potential opt-out situation. I'm not sure whether it's completely opted out at this point, but if you had a large country like that or several others, and that it's not the only country that's opted out of that framework, why would IMO fuels produced in those countries not then be a problem from that accountancy perspective? So for that reason, I think IMO needs to do its accountancy on the shipping emission, international shipping operational emission, but it needs to incentivize and make sure the policy it uses creates the right response on the land side, and that isn't necessarily in conflict with doing accountancy in a rigorous way.
Okay, we only have 1 minute left. I wanted one more question but I suppose we can just bear with me. Perhaps the next one could be for Camille, because there are quite a lot of them. I'll just go with this one. The ISWG outcome contains no operational CIA targets and no consequences for failure. How can it be improved to reduce emissions before 2023? Camille might be muted.
Apologies, I was muted. Yeah, well, thanks. I think first, the proposed draft amendments still need to be discussed and approved by MEPC in a few weeks' time now. And also that's not exactly the scope of today's discussion. But indeed, what I understand of the proposal is that there is a potential for further enhancing the mechanism. It is new concepts that are introduced in the IMO framework. I mean, carbon intensity indicators. So we're building on existing mechanisms, the SAMP, the EEDI, and we're also preparing the ground for future regulations. Just to say a word about this discussion on life cycle assessments. I mean, all the discussion we have today shows the very deep interest of many stakeholders to engage at IMO on these discussions. I think we're all a little bit frustrated not to be able to meet physically or even virtually to discuss that currently. But we'll do our best in the coming months, as I said, to provide platforms for discussion and able to keep the momentum and progress the discussion on this matter. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm afraid we don't have any more time left, so thank you for all your questions asked, and we're sorry we haven't been able to answer all of them. But what we will do, we will pass these on to IMarEST's Marine Fuels and Emissions Special Interest Group, who will be continuing the discussions, and we will be sending out details to attendees of how you can become involved in this group. So I'd just like to thank everybody, all the presenters and the panelists, for their time and their valuable insights. And we do hope that you stay safe and you enjoyed today's discussions. Thank you. Goodbye.